Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to State and State Systems. We're discussing in the class of state building and fragile states. I'm pretty sure that nowadays you are still looking at the case, the warfare with Ukraine and Russia. That particular issue, that particular war is a manifestation of how one country is being challenged in terms of its statehood and its autonomy as a state. Today, we're particularly going to talk about what constitutes a state. Why do we call a state, and what do we mean when we say it is a state? And even further, we're going to look into further what is the functionality of state, which means that how does it work? How does a country work, and what makes it difficult for a country to work properly and appropriately in order to establish itself as an authority, because we know that state is the highest authority within a single territory. Now, when I ask you to look into the common theories of statehood and what does it mean and what components of state, you would usually refer to declarative theory and constitutive theory, and then you'd be right. That's totally justifiable. The most common theories of statehood are constitutive theory, which requires the recognition of other countries in order for a certain country to be considered as a state. In that case, constitutive theory basically argues that it's important for a country to be recognized because they are going to enter an international system where states have relations with one another, and its sovereignty is also recognized by other countries. Therefore, they have an actual autonomy, an actual authority over the population, the government, and the territory. On the other hand, there's another theory of statehood, which argues that you don't need all those recognition as long as you can declare yourself, because de facto, as a matter of fact, you will still become a country, you will still work in reality as a country if you have territory, population, government, and capacity to conduct foreign relations. Just the capacity to conduct foreign relations. You don't have to conduct foreign relations with most countries. Therefore, if we compare it, when we're talking about constitutive theory, it means that countries like Abkhazia and South Ossetia and the Republic of Somaliland and then Transnistria and South Ossetia, those countries are not recognized, including also Nagorno-Karabakh, if you remember the warfare between Armenia and Azerbaijan a couple of years ago. It means that those countries are not countries because they're not recognized by any government outside of themselves. Transnistria is recognized by Abkhazia, and they basically recognize each other. But no other countries, none of them can enter the international system, which is the United Nations. On the other hand, we will still consider countries like Palestine and Israel and Taiwan and Kosovo because they have the recognition from the United Nations, and so many countries, even though not all of them recognize those: Kosovo, Palestine, Israel, and Taiwan. So in terms of their entrance, their participation in the international system, Taiwan and then Kosovo, Israel, and Palestine are countries. But as a matter of fact, do they really work as a country? Well, yeah, of course, they work as a country because as a matter of fact, they are a country. They have a territory, they have population, they have government and a capacity to conduct relations. On the other hand, there are territories who also have the ability to establish its own country, but they don't. We can consider states in the United States of America. They have the territory, they have population, government, capacity to conduct Do they have the capacity to conduct foreign relations? I don't think so. But they don't have recognition from other states. Are they countries? No. Are they states? No. On the other hand, there's a declarative theory, the one that doesn't require recognition from other countries, because they realize that if you want to become a country, you just need to make relations with those that you need to have relations with. We're talking countries like Somaliland. Well, they are established as a country. They don't really have a good capacity to conduct foreign relations. But yeah, they recognize, but there is no recognition from other states. Is there any country who has all these and they have recognition from other states, but they don't have a working government? Yeah, there is a country like Somalia. They have the territory, they have the population, they have government, they have the capacity to conduct foreign relations, but unfortunately, they're not quite a successful country. They are recognized by other countries as the main player in international system on behalf of Somalia. But then Somalian government doesn't have its authority and autonomy over its own population, over its own territory, and its government is basically ineffective. Do we call that a country? But as a matter of fact, yeah, it's international still call that a country. But of course, it's not going to be categorized simply just as a country. It's going to become a weak states, or another term is fragile states, as we're talking about here. But what makes a country fragile? What makes a country strong? We need to understand what is state first and how does it work, because we will go from that point ahead. You see, when you have this component, territory, population, government, capacity to conduct foreign relations, you have these components, but we don't really dig deeper into territory, population. Why do countries need to have all these aspects, and how do they actually use all of these components? Why does it matter that for a country has to have a population, and how do they control the territory? So basically, when we look at a country, of course, every country there has their own objective. Here's the thing that I need you to understand before we go any further. When we are discussing a country, the problem is we have both an expectation and at the same time, there is a reality that we have to face. We have states that possesses autonomy. We expect a country to possess autonomy, to be able to regulate its own people, to create regulation, to enforce its law, and to be able to become what it is, which is the central power, the result of a consolidation of power in a single territory. Which means that we expect country to work in a certain way, of course. It has to act in a certain way because it has objectives. We need to understand that a country needs to behave in a certain way in order to reach their objectives. But on the other hand, it's not always the case. The problem is reality sucks. Reality is difficult to face for these countries because, as a matter of fact, they still need to strengthen. They still need to validate their ability to control over the population, to control the territory, to govern. They need to emphasize that they have the ability of a country to conduct in itself is called state capacity. So they need to have the state capacity. But as a matter of fact, there are very much competing forces that makes it difficult for a country because states must also negotiate their autonomy. See, when we're discussing a country, we need to discuss that there is that a country needs something, right? They need resources. They need to be able to enforce their authority over other social organizations, which means that regulations created by religions, by a company, by a family, by a certain social organization needs to obey the rule created by the preferences of the country, or basically the constitutions, the regulations created by the country. But as a matter of fact, sometimes it's difficult. Therefore, oftentimes, these organizations compromise the autonomy of a country. We can see that in many ways. Invasion is the highest level of compromising the autonomy of a certain country because they're trying to undermine the existence of a certain country. But the question is, would that country who has been invaded has the ability to enact and enforce its autonomy using the use of force? And giving the idea that they are the highest authority, they are the central power in the country. Therefore, we need to understand the expectation first, and we need to see the reality. When understanding the expectation, we do realize and we do need to understand that states have its state capacity, which means that it's the ability of a state to actually conduct the statehood, which means that they have an image, they have an idea of how a country should run, how to conduct the government, how to do well, how the population will obey them, how other social organizations will always follow rules. And state capacity means that these states have the ability to create the smallest gap between the image and reality. They use resources and strategies, and also the use of force in order to manifest as much as possible the image that they have about a country and how a country should be. That's a state capacity. So we're talking about the ideal type of statehood. This is the idea, this is the image, this is what a country should be for many actors. Of course, when you establish a country, it has its own objectives. The first and foremost is the consolidation of political power. When you establish a country, there are so many people that agrees that to a certain level, they are part of the country, which means that to a certain extent, you have to be able to establish yourself as a result of a consolidation of power. How? Well, you can win over a certain kind of a warfare and then you establish your power there. Or well, you can ask the people whether they would want to become part of the state or not. Like, for example, the consolidation of political power can be established in countries like Catalonia. Sorry, they're not countries. In places like Catalonia, but we do realize that there's a consolidation of political power, but that's not the only thing. So the consolidation of political power means that the people agrees to become part of a single political unit, of a single entity, that they consider themselves as part of a same country. This is in line with Benedict Anderson's imagined community. What happened in Indonesia is also an example of consolidation for political power. What I mean by that is the time when we have Sumpah Pemuda in 1928. We have a agreement across different ethnicities in Indonesia. There is a gathering in 28 October 1928. They vow that they will be loyal to the country, they will speak the similar language, and they will be able to establish a country called Indonesia. That's a consolidation of political power in terms of national integrity. But then our founding fathers have the ability to eventually make that come true by defeating and declaring that we are independent as a country. That's the first thing. You have a consolidation of political power. You want to gather as much of political power as possible because you are the winner, you are the victory, you are the one who have victory over the country. Okay. And then the second one is a collective survival. A country wants to survive, of course. They want to be able to protect themselves. They want to be able to protect the population. Well, previously we have the idea of state sovereignty. Of course, it wants to protect itself from other countries. They don't want to be defeated by other countries. They don't want to be governed by other countries. I'm talking places like, for example, the Gorno-Karabakh. They're Armenians. They want to establish their own country, but they don't serve. I don't think they survive because they have been defeated by the Azerbaijan army. So that's a difficult choice for them because they don't have the survival of the country itself, let alone the survival of the people. Collective survival also protects the population from diminishing, which means that they were not being targeted by a genocide. We do remember how Bosnians are being targeted as a genocide. Rohingya are being targeted as well. Armenian are being targeted. It means that there is a single entity, there's a government, there's an authority that provides them with protection so that they will be able to survive. Okay, that's the second objective. And then further, they have another objective, which is to survive themselves, to fulfill their needs. Of course, you're a human being. You need food, you need shelters, you need clothes, you need housing, and then etc. But beyond that, you would also want yourself to prosper, your country to prosper. And that's the objective of a state, in order to be able to provide populations with welfare and even as much as possible provides the largest welfare that the state can provide for those people. Which means that a country has those objectives. They try to consolidate power, they want a collective survival, and they want well-being and prosperity. But how does it manifest? They reach those objectives using a very important tool, which is called state autonomy. This is very important because without state autonomy, a country doesn't have the ability to establish itself. They are considered as the highest authority, which means they need to be able to control themselves internally and establish themselves as an autonomic unit externally, which means that they need to limit. They create the limit. Not only that it is a physical limit, which is a border, but they also need to insulate themselves to enforce that border as a manifestations of their autonomy. Border means that it creates a boundaries. That is the end of things that a country needs to do. What are those things that a country needs to do? They need to regulate the country as much as possible. Therefore, they create regulations and policy because they want a certain kind of a social order and moral order in the country. They create regulations, law, right? They create law. Because they create law, border also means that that's the end of their jurisdiction. That's the end of legal jurisdictions. Beyond that border, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the authority over people in territory and whatever kind of resources they can find beyond that border. It also means that they have the ability to control everything, the population, the human resources, natural resources, the assets, the populations, the territory within the border. And because they need to ensure the population that they are part of this country, they need to they need as much as possible to establish their own collective identity and distribute the idea that the population is part of that collective identity. I'm talking about the national identity here. So which means that a country needs to persuade the people that they're part of a certain country. This happens when, if you remember, when you were young, when you were in the elementary school, people always tell you that you're part of a certain country, and in formal regulations, you are taught about what country it is and what kind of value it upholds, and what kind of situation it faces, and how you should always support your country. That's the establishment of a primary collective identity, which we're going to talk about further later. And border also means that they're insulated from other states. Insulations from other states means that they need to establish the ability that they are a single unity when facing things outwards, which means that, for example, when they're facing other countries, they work as one. A government of a country and the people of a country works as one. They're different from other states. They can separate themselves from other states. For example, we Indonesia are different from those of Malaysia. And if we go abroad, we identify ourselves as Indonesians. That also means that we have an Indonesian passport. We are different from other countries. We have our own regulations. We have our own objectives. We have our own values. That's the insulation from other states. When we're discussing about regulation and policy, state must also consolidate its power. State must also negotiate the power, must also be able to enforce its authority, that they are the highest authority in a single territory, by establishing the power and the superiority over other social organizations, which means that they have to be able to enforce their preferences of regulations, of rules. And if there is any what is it there is any discrepancy, differences between the regulations created by other organizations with the national preferences, it means that those local rules should be abandoned, should be ignored, or otherwise the country will do something about it by using the threat or use of violence to enforce the law. That also means that a country needs to regulate every aspects of their life, and to be able to create a bureaucratic dominations by registering the regulations created and diminishing all the regulations created by other social organizations, showing that they're demonstrating that they have the superiority. And on the other hand, they also have the ability to exert the power abroad as well. For example, we do realize that there are companies entering the country. When it comes to bureaucratic domination and superiority, countries which has this the autonomy should have the ability to establish its power by controlling the way that those companies, the multinational corporation, works in their territory and among the populations. Which means that if there is any regulations that a country is opposed to, that means that a country should have the ability to negotiate as much as possible and force its preferences towards those social organizations in order to obey the rules. Another example is the discussions between IMF and those lending countries. The borrowing countries. Borrowing countries like Ghana and including Indonesia are forced to to adjust their economic policy because they borrow they obtain the packages from IMF. It means that they have weak autonomy. It means that the manifestation of state autonomy is not enforced pretty well. That also means that the state is weakened in that aspect. Therefore, in order to be able to enforce the regulations, they need to use the threat or use of violence itself. And furthermore, because they need to gain financial capability to create regulation and run the government, they need to have the monopoly of resources, which means that they have the ability to extract resources from populations. And also they also have the ability to attract other resources from abroad. They also have the the organizational resources in order to run the government. So the country should have the monopoly of resources. But how do they conduct a country? They create a military to protect the country from outside forces. They also extract resources and grant property rights so the economy would be able to continue further. And of course, more importantly, they need to have a government in order to create regulations to enforce the social moral order that they claim to be the right thing to do through law enforcement. Therefore, a country needs, this is an image. Oh, I need to emphasize this. I emphasize this. This is an image. This is an expectation. So everyone in the country, including everyone in other country, need to have that will and need to have a certain kind of image that a country is. For example, states apparatus needs to have the idea that they are part of a country and they need to play the role as much as possible as part of that states. Well, it depends how they perceive the state itself. If they are able to envision itself as a good country, as an advanced country, and as part of it, and they are willing to take part in that role, in their role in strengthening the country and advancing the country, then they will be able to continue and do things that are strengthening the country itself. So it's a dynamic between states, the populations, and also abroad. Therefore, a country will always need to create its own images and constantly strengthening its images among themselves, trying to figure out their own image, trying to figure out their own vision, and continuously trying to enforce its vision towards its population and also abroad. If this is the time when you understand back then that there are civic education in primary school, because they need you to be able to take part in the population, understanding which ones is right and which ones are the wrong thing. Therefore, states are constantly inducing its image among its populations that they are the highest authority, that they are providing the protection for the people, that they are trying to treat the people better, that they are those who would punish you if you did something wrong. States have the ability to this is the image that they are trying to create. Whether the practice would be like that, that's a different thing. Okay, this is an expectation. So they are trying to build an expectation, a vision, an image, and a perception among people that a country should be like this. Okay, but how does a properly functioning state look like? How does it look like? How does it usually look like? Here's the thing. First of all, they exhibit high levels of internal coherence, which means they have national integrity, which means the population agrees that they recognize the legitimacy of the current government and the state itself towards them, which also means that the people are quite in a good terms with one another. How is it important? Because without a strong social fabric, a country would be very weak. A country would tend to face any oppositions from its own people. I'm talking about rebellions. So if there are peoples who are not satisfied with the current political entity that they are in, they are going to try to rebel and try to create their own political entity. For example, in South Sudan, they create South Sudan. Ethiopia and Eritrea, they try to establish Eritrea in 1990s. And then in Indonesia in 1999, they try to create Timor-Leste. So social fabric means that the people has the ability, that the what is it, the awareness, they acknowledge that they are part of a certain country. If most of the population doesn't agree to that idea, it means that they will agree to create their own country. That's the case of Timor-Leste. But at the same time, if a country has, if a certain people, they still have the ability, they still have the internal coherence that they are part of a certain country, but there are other parties who wants to rebel, who want to create their own country, and they wouldn't be able to do so if the people doesn't support it. Like, for example, we're talking about Organisasi Papua Merdeka or Free West Papua, or M.Int.Rel, or Moro National Liberation Front in the Philippines. They have not been successful because in many cases, the population doesn't support that. That's the idea of a national integrity. That also goes to the extent that a certain country split and divided in so much and polarized so much into two different countries. That creates civil war, like what's currently happening in South Sudan, what has happened in many countries in Central Africa, and then the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Vietnam, and in Indonesia. Did it happen in Indonesia? It happened in Indonesia, civil war? No, it did not happen. But remember something. When we had that 2019 election, the country has been so polarized so much that it affected our national integration. And that's a very dangerous, because it might goes to, if one country has the ability to enforce power, to enforce the military to do something, then probably there will be a coup d'etat. God forbid, no. But yeah, that's how it is. Further, since they have a national identity, they also use rational legal methods to set the perimeters of who gets what, which means that they need to create a law supremacy. Law supremacy means that a country needs to create regulations over the populations, or it need to create regulations over the territory, over everything that happens in the country. And these regulations should also be enforced. That means that there's a legislative body who creates the regulations, and there's also an executive body who executes the activities, those regulations and policies. And at the same time, we also need to have a judicial body, which means that they need to have the enforcement of the law itself. To enforce the law itself, we need to have the use and threat of violence, which means that a country needs to have a monopoly of violence. They need to have the ability to consolidate as much as violence as possible. That's war. That's the point of having a military. If you probably still consider why is it important for us to have a military while we know that we're not going to war, that's the main component of a country, because it established the country as the highest authority, which shows the people that if you do something wrong, I will do something about you. That's a police apparatus. On the other hand, externally, if there is someone or another parties who are trying to mess with us, with the country, the military will do something about it, which means that the use of violence is useful in order to establish the country as the highest authority over other organizations. Oh, this one, highest authority over organizations. That means that a country needs to have its preference of regulations as a priority, and what is it? They need to be able to establish themselves as the highest, which means that if there are other rules other than the state's rules, like for example, religious or from a certain kind of organizations or even ideology, they will have the ability to diminish and banish those rules. If we're talking about Cold War, that's the thing where it happens. If you do remember how Indonesians at that time, we faced 1965, you remember how they're accused of trying to establish a different authority and different rules that the regime at that time the regime at that time doesn't have the ability to control that. We're talking about the Communist Party, and Suharto regime did a coup d'etat, and then they take over the government, and they're trying to diminish the existence of communists and communism across the country, which means that I don't like that rule. It has to disappear from my country. Right. And in order to do that, they need an accountable government. They need an accountable government to implement policies in a way that is faithful to stated policy and written law. The imagined accountable government means that the people within the government needs to be able to run the government itself effectively and doesn't part ways or doesn't deviate from their role as the part of a government. Which means that if there is a weakening government, it means that there are corruptions, there are government apparatus who also kind of manipulate things for their own interests, or they have complicit activities with smugglers, for example, which means that they undermine the state authority by conducting those things. A country should also have an orientation toward economic equality, because that means that the welfare is equally distributed among the populations. Therefore, they have the legitimacy over the populations because they have been able to create equal welfare and equal prosperity across the country. By doing so, they have the legitimacy over the populations because the population will support them. Okay. They also need to protect human rights. This is kind of a little bit in opposition with the use and threat of violence. And also, furthermore, they need to be able to create a propaganda for moral righteousness. The people would always need to be told, to be convinced that the country is doing the right thing and moral things to do. And the country would always have the ability to justify and convince people by those justifications that they are doing the right thing. Which means that a fully functioning state and the population will support whatever it is that the country is trying to do, including invading other countries, like what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. That also means that the people will provide a support for that. Also the case in the United States of America, when they're trying to invade other countries. They need to, as much as possible, convince people that what they're doing is the right thing, because if they don't, they risk themselves of the legitimacy that they have so far obtained from the population. So that's just an ideal. This is just an ideal. This is not the real situations. The problem is reality is not always that beautiful. For one aspect, regulating all aspects of life is overwhelming. State-society relations is a complex phenomenon that burdens state. Why? Because there are so many things to regulate. And states have limited capacity, of course. Government have a limited capacity. They have limited resources. They have financial resources, of course. They have the monopoly over resources. They have monopoly over violence. But that's not enough to run the government and make all people happy, which means that you need to do a lot of things. And government can't always afford to do that, let alone to understand that there are people who are kind of naughty. They're being corrupt. They don't play their role as part of the government apparatus. So reality deviates from the expectations that that they have envisioned that the country would be. On the other hand, to establish the highest authority in the country also means that they need to have resources, be it natural resources, financial resources, and, also, and of course, they need to be able to establish themselves among the population. Well, we do realize that the populations are also part of other social organizations, which means that the country, the state, requires to must negotiate the autonomy to gain alliances with other social organizations. How? Like, for example, they need to negotiate autonomy with a religious body. Like, for example, in Indonesia, we were discussing that the people are quite adhering to religious values. We want the country to also accommodate that. If the country failed to do so, most people will react in a certain way. We can see that when the country is when Muslim populations are demonstrating in 212 movement. If you remember, at that time, huge populations are demonstrating because they see that the government apparatus is not is kind of insulting a certain kind of a religious identity. In that case, state must be able to also accommodate, must also need to acknowledge that other social organizations also have resources. They also have followers. They also have strong, power, that states must also be able to give a certain level of autonomy. By a certain level of autonomy, we provide that by creating MUI, Majelis Ulama Indonesia, or Indonesia Ulama Council. And we provide them with the ability to create fatwa or religious verdict. By those religious edict, verdict, it should be edict, religious edict, or I'll just call it fatwa. By providing those ability for country, for MUI to create fatwa, the country provides an autonomy for that MUI to regulate Muslim populations, which means that a state provides its authority and gives autonomy to a certain other organizations. That also happened to other aspects. Like, for example, we were talking about the existence of Freeport in Papua. They need to have alliances because they need money. That's for sure. We need money from other sources. Other countries have also kind of negotiated with the existence, but therefore their ability to be able to negotiate that autonomy with other actors is considered as state dynamic. State dynamics is the way that power flows repetitively and how the flows change. It means that oftentimes, even though state has the ability, has the authority, they need to give it to a certain extent to another organizations in order to discuss and negotiate their power relations with those other organizations. We do realize that those other organizations are they have their own rules. Therefore, countries must also sometimes bend their rules to accommodate those regulations created by other organizations, which means that states are not high, it's still the highest, but they still need to negotiate with other countries. Therefore, there has been challenges faced by countries when they're trying to establish their own authority as the highest authority as the country. And this is evident in these example. States are not autonomous. That's the question. It's permeable looking at the borders because there are many people, there are many organizations, especially transnational organized crime, who which undermines the existence of a border. The borders has made it difficult for a country to for people to pass through because they need to have permissions to enter or to leave a certain country. But then if a country doesn't have the ability to provide control and the border, it means that the country is weak. That also means not only the physical boundaries, but also the boundaries in terms of political boundaries. I mean, when a country has been able to negotiate its deal with multinational corporations, because there has been a constant interferences by transnational and international state non-state actors. Like for example, from the inside, we have pressures coming from environmental organizations. From abroad, we have pressures from multinational corporations. They're trying to breach the country. They're trying to, as much as possible, to undermine the authority of the country so that the multinational corporation will be able to do whatever they want to the country, including the invasion from other countries, including civil war from within the country. So challenges towards a certain country is faced, and the thing that we need to understand is that there has been an attack on the global on state autonomy, be it coming from inside, from domestic constraints, or international constraints, and that is determined by states' ability to meet the actual practices. This is the practices, right? So a country needs to have their ability to fulfill all these images in order for the country to run properly. It means that everyone needs to play their role accordingly. But however, it's not always the case. Therefore, state capacity is determined by the closing gap of the image and the actual practice. The image means the idea of an actual of how a country should be, and the actual practices, well, the actual practices. State capacity is determined by its ability to create their vision to become real by using all those resources they require. Therefore, what they need to create to have the state capacity is to have the use and threat of violence. And a country needs to also have the ability to exercise violence to establish monopoly. They need to have the image of a state, and that those image that they need to establish is that a state is singular. There's the supreme rule maker, the separate and bounded and as representations. They need to be able to provide the idea for the people and for the population, for the country itself, to believe in themselves that they are states, and the state has the capacity to govern itself. Therefore, constant propaganda is required. On the other hand, they need to be able to practice all those images in real life, because it determines whether the states are weakening or reinforcing. Therefore, they need to be able to enforce it in the forms of all kind of regulations possible. Otherwise, they are dissoluting as a state. Therefore, we need to consider the state as a process, because they are constantly reimagining themselves. The first direction is when a country is strengthening their image of state, and the image is what is it? Is practiced properly in the country. Therefore, they have the real state capacity, and the state autonomy is getting is established. On the other hand, weakening state means that the gap between image and the practice is very far. And this is not an end process. This is constantly going. Therefore, we should see the state as a process, not simply as an end point, because it's constantly happening. Well, I've also provided you with so many examples, so I guess that should be enough for me. So yeah, that's it. A state should be able to establish its autonomy, and that autonomy is the image that they're trying to envision. They want to be in a certain way, and they have, when a country have the ability to manifest and to implement that image, to implement what they expect to become, they are strengthening themselves. And meanwhile, if they are not able to to fulfill the functionality that states are expected, they are weakening. Well, that should be all for me from this meeting. That's the meeting discussion for state system and states should be conducted further today. Thank you very much for your attention. Let's see each other in another opportunity. I hope you find it useful and see you next opportunity. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.